Hi everybody, this is Miss Corey, and today we are going to do U3-L1 Intro to Ancient War in Sun Tzu. So, your learning target is you are going to identify ancient weapons and their technological advantages. Your job, you're going to watch this ed puzzle all the way through to the end, and while watching, any questions I ask you in blue text, you need to answer on the ed puzzle. You do not need to write those in the study guide, just answer them on the ed puzzle. And while watching, any vocab words that is in magenta text, take notes on your study guide under lesson 1. So before we get into the notes today, we have, I want to look at Unit 3 as a whole. So you're going to actually have 2 Unit 3 study guides. There's this one that you have access to right now, which is Unit 3 Study Guide Part 1. So that is now through April 26th. And then you're going to have Unit 3 Study Guide Part 2, which is going to be from April 27th to May 19th. So for the one that we have now, you are going to have movies like The Art of War, which is a documentary. You're going to have Red Cliff and also Braveheart. And then in the second part of Unit 3, you're going to have American Sniper and In This Corner of the World. So you're probably like, wait, did you say we end Unit 3 in May 19th? Yeah, you heard me correct. This unit is incredibly large, so that's why I want to go through it with you so you kind of know what's going on since this unit's going to last 2 months. Over 2 months. Isn't that crazy? All right, so let's zoom in. So here's the calendar. Oh, sorry. This is the big calendar that you can find on Schoology under the Unit 3 folder. So I'm just going to kind of zoom in into 2 pieces. So the top half and the bottom half, or else it's kind of hard to read. So the top half. So Unit 2, you just got done on Thursday, on here Friday, March 17th. You are watching this video right now, so you're starting Unit 3. Nice job. And then what we're going to do for next week is we're going to start watching Art of War, which is a documentary about Sun Tzu and his book called The Art of War, which is very famous. You'll learn all about it. And then you're going to watch the Three Kingdoms Ed puzzle, which talks about the end of the Han Dynasty and the beginning of the Three Kingdoms and pretty much sets up the scene for what Red Cliff is as a movie. And then starting on March 24th, you're going to start watching Red Cliff. Now, Red Cliff is an interesting movie because there are 2 versions of Red Cliff. There is a 4.5-hour version and there is like a 2.5-hour version. And originally I had you watching the 4.5-hour version. And then I thought about it and I went, oh man, I don't really want to watch 4.5-hour video, and I'm sure you don't either. So I opted for the 2.5-hour version. The downfall to that, it doesn't get as much detail and it's a little bit more fast paced and confusing in that sense. But I will make notes to help you guide along with that movie. It's also entirely in Chinese. So yay. There's also a dub version of it too. I haven't decided which one I'm going to post yet. All right. So in week 3, you're just going to watch Red Cliff a little bit more. And then you have spring break. Crazy, right? So during spring break, enjoy. It's also a good time to get caught up in my class if you're behind. And then, oops, sorry, didn't mean to go that far yet. And then for week 4, so this is where I had you continue watching like the 4.5-hour version of Red Cliff, but I decided not to. So instead, for week 4, that whole week is going to be dedicated to you catching up. A lot of you are behind in my class, and this is the chance to get caught up. Like seriously, like get caught up. For those of you who are caught up, I appreciate you and thank you. So for week 4 of Unit 3, what your mandatory assignment is that you need to fill out the weekly check-in. This is the only way I'm going to take attendance that week, besides you like turning in old assignments. So make sure that you do the week 29 weekly check-in that week, because that's how I'm going to take attendance. Also, if you turn in any missing work during catch-up day or any time before then, or even any time after that, please email me because Schoology sometimes doesn't let me know that you turned something in. So please email me when you turn something in. All right, so then going on to the other half of Unit 3. So in week 5, we start the intro to medieval warfare, and then you're going to start watching Braveheart, which is a super Hollywoodized movie, but that's okay because it's entertaining. And then after Braveheart into week 6, you're going to start watching American Sniper, which was your choice that y'all voted on. And I'm very happy with that choice. That was a good choice, y'all. And then also note on April 30th, part study guide, Unit 3 study guide part 1 is due. So I'm going to stop the Unit 3 study guide part 1 here on April 26th. And then on April 27th, you are going to start up the Unit 3 study guide part 2. So that's why Unit 3 study guide part 1 is due on April 30th. And then into week 7, you're just going to continue watching American Sniper, and then we'll do a day in the legacy of Chris Kyle. May 8th, so in week 8, May 8th, that's just going to be a catch-up day. And then we are going to do an intro to the other side of war and then start watching In This Corner of the World, which is a Japanese perspective of World War II as civilians. And then after we're done in week 9 watching In This Corner of the World, you're going to do your Unit 3 summative, which I'll explain later, those details. All right. And then everything is, let's see here, and then the Unit 3 study guide part 2 will be due on May 21st. And then we'll start up Unit 4, which will be our last unit. On May 22nd. I know, right? You're like, what the heck? Why are you talking about May? I know this unit's huge. That's okay. All right, so what we're going to do now is we're going to talk about the basics of ancient war. Now, there is a million things, and million is probably not an understatement in this. To talk about the ancient war, I'm just going to talk about some of the more popular weapons or unique weapons during that time. So I'm sorry, I'm skipping a lot of stuff, but that's okay. All right, so the first thing that we're going to talk about, which is a vocab word, which is chariots. So chariots were first used in Mesopotamia about 3000 BCE. Um, Especially if you haven't been in a world history class. Mesopotamia is in what we now call like the Middle East. And it was first used actually in royal funeral processions. It was not used in warfare. The earlier versions typically had 4 wheels, but later on they would have 2 wheels, like you see in this picture here. This is a Mesopotamian relief. Also a fixed axle and a fixed pole that attached the yoke to the oxen. In this example here, there's horses, but oxen were originally the animals that pulled chariots. So chariots, the cool thing about them is they held 2 people. Later on, they'll hold like up to 4 people, but earlier versions it's 2. So mounted by both a charioteer who would steer and a spearman. So one for driving and one for stabbing. It is also, like I said before, driven by oxen. So here's like a little picture of an oxen pulled cart. Horses weren't domesticated until about 2000 BCE. So there's probably about 1,000 years between oxen just pulling chariots to the introduction of horses pulling chariots. Oxen are also a lot stronger than horses and they pull a lot more weight. All right, so by 2000 BCE, chariots became a lot lighter as well. So the axles were movable, so it was easier to steer, and also spoked wheels. And spoked wheels you can see here on the picture. So instead of like a solid wheel, it just had like the circular outside, and then it had those posts, right, that you see right here sticking out from the axle. That was a really big innovation because it not only made the chariot a lot lighter, it also made the wheels stronger. So they wouldn't break as often. So a horse plus chariot at about 2000 BCE meant vast military conquest because it could carry 2 or more men. It could outpace any human on foot. Um, Also, the size of the chariot would provide a little bit of protection to the riders, and it could also be used to carry goods on military campaigns. All right. So it was first used by the Hyksos. And if you've never heard the Hyksos before, they're a really interesting thing to study. But what they or who they were a mysterious people, and no one knows where they came from or anything about them because they didn't have a written language and they left very little evidence behind. They actually invaded and took over Egypt in 1638 BCE. Here's kind of like a map of the area here up in gold of where they took over. Then the Egyptians, of course, started using chariots because the Hyksos took them over. And then the Hittites in Anatolia, which is in modern day Turkey, about 1600 BCE. The Aryans in India, which was anywhere between 2000 and 1500 BCE. Also, really interesting to learn about Aryans because they're also kind of a mysterious peoples. And then the Mycenaeans in Greece in about 1400 BCE. In 1500s BCE, there was also graves in China that had pieces of chariots or horse gear. So it's also believed China had chariots as well. So by the 320s BCE, chariots became pretty much obsolete. It was way easier just to do warfare on the back of the horse with the use of the saddle. Chariot races were still kind of nostalgic, so they were used in popular ancient Olympic games where they would kind of like a modern day racetrack that had like an oval shape and they'd run around and they'd crash into each other and people would die and get trampled and just a lot of blood. Yeah. So in the ancient Olympic Games started with the Greeks in about 700 BCE and ended with the Romans in 393 CE. All right, we're going to talk about the next one, which is a triome. So here's an artist's rendition of a triome. Name two things that you notice about it besides it's a boat. Don't say it's a boat. We all know it's a boat. Like, what are two other things you notice? So a triome. It was an Athenian Greek warship. So it was the fastest warship for its time at 7 knots, which is approximately 8 miles per hour. I know right now it's like really 8 miles per hour, and it's like that was really fast back in Athenian Greece. There were 170 rowers specialized to maneuver the ships. These weren't everyday people; they were specially trained to row these. It can make extremely sharp turns, which was new in the ancient world. It was also very slim, so it could fit into narrow waters and do surprise attacks. It also had a battering ram on the front, to sink your enemy ship. And it was famous for the technology that the Athenian navy used to defeat the invading Persians in 480 BCE. All right, next we're going to talk about war elephants because I was like, oh yeah, war elephants are always interesting to talk about. So yes, you're like, really? They used elephants for war? Yeah, it was like a thing. So they used it to break ranks of enemy lines. Elephants really instill fear in enemies because A, they're huge and B, they're loud. And it's also used in places such as ancient Greek, India, Rome, China, and Persia. They're the most famous for using war elephants. And so, what war elephants were, as you can see here, here's more of a like kind of a middle-aged instead of an ancient kind of picture of it. But you'll see here that they're armored, and they have like a little ladder. They have lots of spears, so like the people on top can stab the enemy below with their long spears, and then about four people would sit up on top of the elephant and shoot arrows or stab people. All right. Oh, yeah. Riders on top are called the elephantry, by the way. Very interesting. So, famously, Alexander the Great faced war elephants in what is now today modern day Pakistan, which was originally part of the Indian Empire. He lost a great number of men during that time. A lot of it was because of trampling. So elephants are big. You're going to die if you get stepped on one. Also, they had spikes on their tusks. So pretty much if you get close to them, you're dead. They also had countermeasures, such as stabbing elephants in the legs. Um, and that would lose mobility of the elephant because, of course, can't walk anymore. Also, if an elephant would rebel against like the Indian soldiers themselves instead of attacking what the enemy should be. Soldiers, there were specialized soldiers like behind them that had poisoned sticks that would stab them and kill the elephant if they were out of control. Yeah, interesting. All right. So the bow and arrow. I know this seems probably one of the most basic weapons, but it's also the most widespread weapons. So what it is an elastic launch device, which is the bow with projectiles, which are arrows. Arrows have sharp ends and a stabilizer fins on the back end, usually like those feathers. The earliest evidence came from South Africa in a cave, and it's dated about 75 to 60,000 years ago that humans started using bow and arrows. The first bows were made out of wood, and bowstring was made out of fiber. That fiber could be anything like hemp, vegetation fiber, which is also hemp, or hair. The first arrows were usually made out of wood with flint or an obsidian tip. So they were used in hunting and warfare. The importance of them is that they're a long range weapon. So ancient arrows or bow and arrows could reach anywhere between 64 and 180 meters. If you need that in American terms, that's about 1.5 football fields. All right. So next up, we have the phalanx. Now, there's two different kinds of phalanx. There's the Greek and the Macedonian. We'll talk about the Greek first. So a phalanx, that's a tactical position for battle. It's usually made up of hoplite soldiers, and what hoplite soldiers were, they're typically citizen soldiers. So, example, they could just be farmers that were trained to become soldiers. They were trained, but they weren't like super elitely trained. But phalanxes were really easy to form once you knew what you were doing. So what happened is the soldiers would stand side by side, and their shields would be overlapping one after the other. And then spears would be sticking out in the gaps. I'll show you a picture on the next slide. So pretty much was a giant wall as shield and spears. It was used famously in the Battle of Thermopylae, which was the Greeks versus the Persians, and that's where King Leonidas killed 20,000 Persians with only about 300 men, um, more or less. There's some other historical records that says he has more, but we won't get into that today. All right, so here's kind of a picture of what the phalanx looks like. You can see here's like the front view. It is just a wall of shields with spears, and they're moving at you. Here's more of a side view. You can just see how all these soldiers are just lined up in just a giant wall with their spears poking through the gaps. All right, and then there's the Macedonian phalanx, very similar but a slightly different. So Macedonia was a very large military superpower from about 808 to 168 BCE, um, and it created something called the New Macedonian phalanx. What the difference was is that the soldiers actually had less armor, and they had longer spears. So here's my question: how would less armor and longer spears help soldiers? So, with less armor and longer spears, it was really easy to move with less weight. You don't get as tired as often either, and you can travel a lot quicker. Longer spears means less close range combat. Okay, so that means you don't have to get in the face of the enemy. You're a lot more protected. It also had a mix of cavalry, so soldiers on horses, and infantry, so soldiers on foot. And the Macedonians also invented catapults at this time because they need to smash down those walls. All right, so here is a Macedonian phalanx. You can see the spears are much longer. So there's a lot more protection for the soldiers. Here is a catapult. And good old Lord of the Rings. Wish we could watch those movies in here. They're not like history movies though, but they are cool. All right, so here's just kind of an example again. Here's the Greek. Again, you can see slightly more heavily armed. Spears are shorter. This one, the Macedonian, longer spears. All right, let's talk about horses. So horses, they're a greatest animal companion to human society. At least for warfare, that is. I mean, you could argue dogs too, I guess. So they can ride, or you can ride on them. You can pull carts and farm equipment. They can be used for battle, used for art and social status. You can eat them too if you need to. Paleolithic art of wild horses in caves date back to 30,000 BCE. Domesticated horses are about 3,500 BCE, but they really don't reach other parts of the world, like in Europe and Asia, until about 2000 BCE. So they originally are domesticated on the Eurasian steppes, which is the border of like Europe and Asia. And it is used in ancient cultures such as China, Rome, Greece, Egypt, Assyria, and Persia. Not only can they be ridden, but they can also pull chariots, like we talked before. So, what does someone need before a horse can be ridden? Yes, if you looked at your vocab words on your study guide, you'll kind of see that the answer is already there. It'd be saddles and stirrups. So, saddles. The Assyrians invented them in about 700 BCE. So a lot later than when horses were domesticated. And saddles back in the Assyrian time were nothing fancy like we have today. They were usually just a thick cloth or piece of leather laid over the back of the horse. It is just simply used to sit more comfortably on the horse, and it also had to use hands to steer and control the horse at this time too. So it was a little inefficient to use for warfare in the early ancient era. But these things called stirrups were made. So they are the things that dangle from the saddle, so human can put their feet in to steer the horse and for mounting. It was created by the Persians about 200 BCE, and it allowed a person to ride a horse with their hands empty. So here's a picture of a modern day stirrup. So if a person's hands are free while riding a horse, thanks to the saddle and stirrup, what do you think people, specifically soldiers, are going to start carrying in their hands while riding horses? Weapons. Yes, it's gonna be weapons. So that's why horses are so important with the stirrup and saddle, because now you can stab people on horseback. All right. Next, we're going to talk about the spatha. So that was a sword that was used by the average foot soldier in the Roman army. It's pretty much like your basic sword. It was anywhere between 19 and 34 inches long. Here's a picture here next to a person, so you can kind of see how long that is. It the kind of the innovative thing about it is use pattern welding, and that is where you take many pieces of metals, you heat them up really hot, and then you hammer them on an anvil to create the desired blade shape. It also creates a really strong core because it is a mix of many metals. So because it's also a mix, you can use lighter metals, and it makes the swords a lot lighter, but still maintaining its strength. All right, another sword that we're going to talk about is the Dao. And that is a single-edged Chinese sword. It was first made in the Shang Dynasty. The Shang Dynasty was was in the Chinese Bronze Age, which was between 1600 and 1045 BCE. The unique thing about it is a curved blade, and usually the hilt, which is like the handle of the sword, is sometimes curved in the opposite direction for more powerful thrusting and cutting. You can see an example in this picture. So it was also had a cup-shaped guard, so that's this little piece right here between like the hilt and the blade, so your hand doesn't slip off. It was used to prevent rainwater from getting into the scarab. A scarab is like the case that you put the sword in. And it was also used to collect blood from the arm so the sword doesn't get slippery. Isn't that great? When your arm's all bloody and stuff, you know. All right. So Redcliffe. That is the movie that we're like the feature film that we're gonna watch. Before that, you're gonna watch Art of War, which is a documentary. So it was a movie produced in between 2008 and 2009. It is a Chinese filmed. So it is subtitled. There is a dub version. I don't know which one I'm going to have you use yet. There's a 2.5-hour version and a 4.5-hour version. I decided for the 2.5-hour version. It takes place at the end of the Han Dynasty. So U3-L5 is going to give you a little bit more background about the specific wartime conflict, but I'll talk about a little bit of the Han Dynasty. Whoops, too fast. So the Han Dynasty was from 221 BCE to 220 CE. So got it like, you know, over 400 years. So beforehand, China was broken up into the Zhou dynasty and several warring states. What a warring state is like an independent territories that are always fighting over land with their neighbors. The ruler of the region, Qin, in Zhou dynasty, so Shi Hongdi conquered the warring states in Zhou, and that's where he expanded his territory to cover most of modern day China. So you can see here's a map of the Han Dynasty. It's everything here in blue. You can also see the Great Wall of China is being built during this time as well. Whoops, I think I skipped a slide. There we go. So we're going to talk about the Han Dynasty, but there's a lot to talk about. So we're just going to focus on society because you'll get the war background in L5. Um, so back in 2 CE, the Chinese government takes a census, and under the Han Dynasty, there is more than 60 million people that live in it. There's multiple generations that usually live under the same house. The eldest males were the head of the family, and there was a large respect for elders, ancestors, and the gods. Women who were wives or moms to the emperor or other highly ranking officials did have a little bit of influence over like their male relatives, but otherwise females were subjugated to males. Parents chose who the woman would marry, and the bride would go to live with her husband's family, and the bride would have to prove herself to her mother-in-law that she was worthy. The bride competed with the mother-in-law as well for the attention and influence of what would be the bride's husband or the mother-in-law's son. Oops. Just kind of give you a quote of what it was like to live back then. So it says traditional beliefs about conduct for women are preserved in a biography of the mother of the Confucian philosopher Menji. So, a woman's duties are to cook the 5 grains, heat the wine, look after her parents in law, make clothes, and that is all. She has no ambition to manage affairs outside the house. She must follow the 3 submissions. When she is young, she must submit to her parents. After her marriage, she must submit to her husband. When she is widowed, she must submit to her son. So, pretty much, Chinese women were ruled by men, which is not a fun time. Here's just kind of a social pyramid of Chinese society. Emperor, that's the top dog. If there was in the Chinese society, if it was split off like into different regions, they would have vassals like governors. Um, there's also state officials and nobles and scholars that would be in the next tier. Peasants are actually above artisans and merchants in Chinese society because peasants were seen as kind of like the backbone of society since they did all the farming. Then under them are artisans and merchants. And then you got the soldiers. And of course, you have the enslaved people. All right, so Sun Tzu. He was a military general, strategist, and philosopher. So he lived sometime between 771 and 256 BCE. No historian actually knows the answer. He lived in the time of the Warring States period. So that's when 6 primary Chinese civilizations were in constant battle over land and resources. It is still unknown if he was really a real person. So there's little historical evidence about him outside of his book called The Art of War. Whoops. So The Art of War is his famous book that he writes. You can buy it still today. Actually, Costco sells it. That's interesting. So The Art of War is a systematic guide to strategy and tactics for rulers and commanders. The book discusses various maneuvers and the effect of terrain on the outcome of battle. It stresses the importance of accurate information about the enemy's forces, dispositions, and deployments and movements. I didn't quite know how to summarize that, so that's why I just put it in a big quote. So sorry. All right. There are also lots of famous quotes from The Art of War. Some of them are appear weak when you are strong. And the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. All right, so wrap up. We talked all about these things. Sorry, I'm running out of time. Next up, you're going to watch U3-L2, L3, and L4, which is the Art of War by the History Channel. Watch them, answer the questions that pop up on your study guide. If you have any questions or comments or want to learn more, email me or come to office hours. Thank you. Bye.